How's it going, YouTube? Yeah, Pat back here, bringing you a different kind of video. I'm bringing you a singles beginner team, just like an introductory to how to build for singles. This is like very introductory. I'm kind of focusing this around people who are very new to the game. I've had a couple friends join Draft League and play in my singles leagues over in TGR, and they're pretty new to Pokemon in general. Sometimes it being kind of their first experience, and Draft League is a lot. In fact, when I've chatted with them about how they're doing in the league and what they think about it, they've mostly said that it's just so overwhelming about how many different things that there are going on in Pokemon, and they felt overwhelmed. And so part of my idea is that with this video and a series of other videos along with it, to try to reduce the amount of unknown factors happening in Pokemon and try to narrow down the thought process for them to help them with their team building and how they want to play and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, let's go and dive into it. So first off, the recommended kind of setup that I think a team should have, and again, this is very introductory, there's a lot of different options aside from this, is to have something like this, where there's 2 sweeping options, 1 revenge killer, 1 pivot, and then 2 walls. And this kind of creates like a mix of the 3 Pokemon up top being heavy offensive types, and the 3 Pokemon in that bottom section being more along the defensive kind of setup. So I think in general, these are some examples of Pokemon that can fit in that role. Some of these Pokemon fill other roles as well. So Dragapult could be a pivot, even though I have it in the revenge killing section. There's some Pokemon in the sweeper section that could do fairly well as pivots and things like that. So Pokemon don't always fill just one role, but these are some examples of Pokemon that can fill this role if this is something that you're trying to figure out with your team. And I'll talk about each of the different roles that a Pokemon can play and what kind of things you're looking for a Pokemon in order for it to fill that role. So first off, let's talk about the sweeper. So there are a couple examples here on the side, and then some characteristics of Pokemon that are sweepers in the game. You want to look for Pokemon that have setup moves of some kind. And there's a ton of options for setup move. You could have Calm Mind, you could have Bulk Up, Sword Stance, Booster Energy is a bit of setup. All different kinds of stuff like that. Agility, Nasty Plot. There's a ton of different setup moves, but sweepers tend to have some kind of setup move that they can use. Boosting abilities or moves. So Iron Moth is a great example of this. It has Fiery Dance. It has a 50% chance to raise your special attack, so giving you kind of a setup move that boosts your damage output while attacking. Or they might have boosting abilities, like Spectrier has Grim Neigh, increases special attack when it gets a KO. Salamence has Moxie, increases its attack when it gets a KO. So things like that are also things that you want to look for in terms of having a sweeper, so that you can get that boost and continue to pick up KOs. And then they tend to have high speed and damage. And Pokemon tend to fall into one of these last 2 categories for sweepers that tend to be their high speed and damage. And that's all the 3 Pokemon except Registeel. Or sometimes sweeper options can be kind of unkillable bulk. The most common option for unkillable bulk is going to be an Iron Defense Body Press kind of Pokemon. So Registeel is an example of that. You just have a ton of HP and a ton of special defense, and then you Iron Defense up, and then you do a ton of damage with Body Press. So those are the kind of options you want to look for when you're setting up your sweepers. Now, in the beginning, I mentioned having 2 options as sweepers, and that's mainly because that once you have one of them, sometimes it's not able to get the job done quite, but it's able to kind of break through, and then your other sweeper is able to finish off the rest of the game. So it's a good idea, I think, to have 2 on the team, and these are going to be your win conditions when you're putting your team together. And these are some options. Like I mentioned, there's a ton of different Pokemon, there's a ton of different setup moves available, and so just kind of when you're building your team, look to create 2 Pokemon that you think could win the game by getting some of these boosting or setup moves going. I would recommend having one that's a physical attacking option, something like Salamence, where it's dealing physical damage, and then another one that's a special attacking set, something like Spectrier. But if you can't have one of each, then having 2 of one kind is totally fine too. The other one is you want to have, I think, 2 walls, and I'd kind of suggest having one that's a physically defensive wall and one that's a specially defensive wall when you're putting your team together. And those can take all different varieties, but some characteristics to look for are to have high defenses and or some immunities. So Ground types can be good-ish walls because they're immune to electric. You might have flying types that are immune to ground attacks. You might have fairies that are immune to dragon attacks, things like that. And they tend to have naturally high defenses. Now, it's also kind of important that they have some sort of disruptive move. That disruptive move could be a lot of different things. You could have something that's like a phasing move where it has like whirlwind or roar, so it stops those sweepers. You might have something that is a status move of some kind, like a thunder wave or a spore or a toxic, things like that, that stop those setup Pokemon, those sweepers, from winning the game. And then they tend to have some kind of hazard control, but they don't necessarily always, but you just tend to have some space in your moveset to fill those. Something like a toxic spike, something like a spikes or rocks. They tend to have something along those lines. They might have hazard control from a defensive side, where they're helping your team to use defog or rapid spin, something along those lines to help keep hazards off of your side of the field. And then recovery is a nice option as well. Things like roost or recover or regenerator. A lot of those different things are very helpful. I have 2 Pokemon here that have like a really nice ability that make them pretty good walls. Unaware is a really nice ability to have, just because those sweepers that have setup, you just don't care about it. You don't care about the boost that they have to their moves. So things like Nasty Plot you ignore if you have Unaware. So Clefable here and Clodsire both have Unaware, make some pretty nice options in terms of walls. And there's a ton of different other options when it comes to walls, but I think they tend to have this kind of mixture of characteristics. And I mentioned one physical defensive wall and one specially defensive wall. When you're putting your team together, it just gives you nice options against whatever your opponent might have. The other 2 Pokemon on your team, I think one of them should be a Revenge Killer. Idea here is that you just want something that is really fast and has pretty high damage output. Now, if you don't have something with a lot of speed, you could also have something with priority attacks. So like Lucario has a ton of priority. It's got like extreme speed, bullet punch, vacuum wave, things like that. So things that are likely to go first against your opponent, those kind of things are really nice to have too. And it's usually want to have high speed and damage or have priority attacks with like a lot of damage, because then when your opponent tries to come in and use their sweeper option to try to beat you, then you have something that can either be faster and pick up a KO against it if it's chipped down a little bit, or have something that has priority that will be it where it doesn't matter how fast your opponent is, and you can just use that move. They tend to have fairly wide coverage, and momentum is kind of nice to have them on them as well. Something like a U-turn or a Volt Switch or a Flip Turn, something like that. Because a lot of times people will switch out their Pokemon instead of allowing it to be revenge killed. So having that momentum attack keeps you in the game, and you can respond to what they're doing. And then the last role that I think is important to have for a team is a pivot. And this one I would say is a little bit more of like a defensive kind of Pokemon. They tend to always have momentum attacks of some kind, that U-turn, that Volt Switch that we were talking about earlier. A lot of times you can fit hazard control on your pivot Pokemon as well. Something like a Defog, something like a Stealth Rock, something along those lines. And then they tend to have some disruption or support. Things like screens, Intimidate is nice. Knockoff is a good option to have as well. Sometimes these Pokemon are nice to fit like Thunder Wave or things like that on as well. And then they just tend to have some natural bulk to them as well, to where they don't necessarily need the recovery. They're not trying to stay in and kind of wall a Pokemon, but you want to use them as a pivot. Oftentimes a slow pivot is really nice as well, and it allows you to get into your sweeper without them taking a whole lot of damage. And that's just a general idea of what you could do to build a team for singles. And this is not the only way, but this video is really designed for people who are new at the game, who are trying to figure out, how do I build a team? How do I play this game and have a good time using it? So just in a general sense, these are some Pokemon that are examples of that. I had a couple more examples there, and you want to look out for those characteristics when you're building your team. And if you do this, you're going to go pretty far. I used a lot of these ideas when I was building for one of my YCL singles runs, and I ended up winning the whole thing and went undefeated. So like, this idea, as basic as it looks, is pretty solid, and it can do well in a lot of situations. So if you'd like to see some more content similar to this, let me know what other ideas or info you'd like to hear more about in the comments down below. and like, subscribe, and all that stuff, and I will catch you on the next video.